So my foundation is going to be researching these disciplines, because most of the experts say that if you're hearing information and serving others, you process that information differently. And we're going to be talking the vicarious trauma that you absorb from your work, okay? So I wanted to give you some core definitions here, because one of the things I noticed when I did my research was that most of our higher ed participants, and I measured in between 400 and 300 participants on this question, do you know what vicarious trauma is? And if so, did you receive any? And what did that look like to you during this time period? And if you didn't receive any vicarious trauma, let me give you the definition. And I'm sure that most of you would not be surprised to hear that after I defined what vicarious trauma was, most of our colleagues, there was an uptick. And they said, well, actually, I did experience that. Can I change my answer? So specifically, 12 people on my survey said no, without a doubt, they did not have vicarious trauma. I then educated them and they changed to yeses. And then 26 said, I'm not really sure. And those all became yeses after the definition. So vicarious trauma, we're talking about the brain, cognitive, physical, emotional, spiritual. We're talking about the interchangeable terms and not focusing too much on that. But more specifically is the third bullet here, which is vicarious trauma is defined as the negative feelings that occur when you hear stories about other people's traumatic things. It's work-related secondary exposure. Because of what we do for a living, you are going to hear these stories. Some examples, this is normally in the training when I talk about the difference between a trigger warning and an activation alert. So I'm going to be talking about things and challenging you to think about your vicarious trauma. So that's not so much a trigger warning, that's more an activation alert. And the difference is that I'm going to be asking you at some point later on to think about some of the things that I'm sharing with you, and that will activate a response in you. So it might not be today or during this hour because you're in the middle of your workday, but maybe in a week, something will resonate and that will activate another part of your emotional response. So specifically, the stories that we're hearing during COVID are very traumatic, right? I mean, we're hearing about students who are food deprived. We're hearing about they had to relocate and now they're in a space that they don't think is safe or conducive to their academic needs.
Right.
So during the semester, you might in your position be the person that hears about mental health challenges with a student. Your staff might share with you about a death of a loved one, or in the capacity of your job, you're supposed to be the front line. So you're the one that if there is a sexual assault on campus, sexual violence happens, you have to hear about that story. So those are all positions that are absorbing vicarious trauma.
4 times. You'll get a whole hour.
If you can mute your line, that would be great because I'm talking over someone.
And that's equal to 30, right?
So what I wanted to tell you was what vicarious trauma is not. So vicarious trauma is not post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. I'm going to tell you the differences. So post-traumatic stress disorder is you've experienced the trauma, and you can go to a doctor, you can say, these are my symptoms, they can diagnose you, you can get medication, you can get counseling, you can get some kind of plan to help with your PTSD. Vicarious trauma, you can have vicarious trauma the same time that you have PTSD, because let's say that you were in part of a situation, but now you have to talk about it with your colleagues, that talking could be the vicarious trauma.
40 minutes
Vicarious trauma does not have symptoms. It has indicators. The difference is that vicarious trauma is not something that's in the DSMR. It's not something that a psychiatrist can diagnose you. Essentially, everyone has vicarious trauma. How you exhibit it and how you process it is going to be very different. Have said 100%, sorry, they're trying to mute the line as I'm talking. I don't think I'm muted, so I think I'm good. So you can't go to a doctor and say, I have the vicarious trauma, and they give you a pill and it goes away. That's not how vicarious trauma works. So the second part of the session, you'll be able to hear specific coping strategies to help. Okay, I think they figured out the lines, and I'm hoping that I'm not muted. I can't really see or tell, so let's just move forward. You want to know what vicarious
Jill,
trauma? Yes.
Jill, this is Melinda. You are unmuted. I have figured out
Okay.
how to mute people.
You're the best.
Do it one by one, and I accidentally muted you, but now you are good. And
Okay, thank you.
but
You're the
we can
best.
hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry. Moving along. Indicators of vicarious trauma. This is the slide that most of my participants in my workshops and my friends and colleagues and everybody really it resonates with. So I gave you a bullet point list. And what we need to do as higher professionals is kind of identify which one resonates the most with you. I mean, all joking aside, I do blame a lot of my overeating on my vicarious trauma, but I'm sure that my coach, my athletic trainer wouldn't appreciate that. But in general, this list is going to change for you during the day. It's going to change to you during the incident and during the year. And why is that? Well, it's because other factors going on in your home life are going to impact how you choose to respond to an indicator of your vicarious trauma. So for example, an incident that you've processed and now you're sitting at home and you're telling that story to a loved one or a colleague, you start getting angry. The next day, another incident happens. You might not stay in the anger phase. You might actually be more sad now. The key to understand is kind of highlight which ones are like your top fives, so that way we can create a plan to address those specific ones. So nightmares, for example, I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised to hear that most of the participants of my research, our colleagues indicated that nightmares and dreams and loss of sleep were the three heightened indicators of how they feel that they're dealing with their trauma. And then other parts of this list, the stress and anxiety, were the other two that came forward in the research that I conducted. So our peers feel that stress and anxiety is in the moment, how they present their vicarious trauma, and then as they've processed it through their day, through their week, through the weekend, it kind of molds into the not sleeping, the nightmares kind of component. So you can see that there is some cross between PTSD and vicarious trauma, but they are very different. You can have numerous points of vicarious trauma at one time. And like I said, they can change daily, they can change hourly. PTSD typically boxes you into one response and you stay in that until you get treatment. So there is some cross, but in general, vicarious trauma is very complex. Okay, so in my research participants, I kind of focused on the Title IX agents. Those are the people who hear sexual violence stories. So your residential life people, your student conduct, all of those different sectors. And of the 253 participants, and I said, if you have a story, would you tell me a little bit about it? Like, tell me specifically, what do you think resonated with your vicarious trauma? I had 126 disclosures. That's almost half of the participants shared with me a really robust story of what they're going through at work. And that was just asking the Title IX individuals about their vicarious trauma. That wasn't everybody that's like on this call right now. Of the 126, some themes kind of emerged. I've already highlighted that stress, anxiety, and the dreams did. But also, one thing that we're going to get to is the guilt. The guilt was really prevalent with our colleagues, indicating that they heard this story about their student or their staff and they no longer had desire to go and watch TV or go to the movies or those things that we might take for granted now that we're in COVID and we can't do. But in general, they couldn't disattach themselves. And that's something that I'm seeing in COVID with a lot of my clients right now. They're indicating that they're having this guilt, this feeling where they're hearing stories from their students that don't have access to food, or they're hearing stories where they don't have internet connections and they can't be academic successful. Meanwhile, we have food, we have resources, we have support, and guilt is coming forward. All of those feelings are very normal. I do want to validate that and just explain that there are some protective factors on how you can kind of process this all. Otherwise, you're going to go into that danger zone of burnout. And I'll share a little bit about that. So what are protective factors? This is the good stuff. Good and some interesting stuff. So in general, the participants who shared with friends and therapists are doing the best. That kind of makes sense to all of us that looked at my research findings, that if you've gone to talk to a therapist because of what you do for a living, think of, you know, the social workers who see social workers, or the police officer that goes and talks to someone. Like, you're very enlightened, you're in tune with what you need, you get that you can't do this alone. Maybe those stigmas of what it means to see a therapist doesn't mean a lot to you, and you're like, I just need the support and I'm okay with it. But friends serves as a protective factor. So when you have an incident that happens at work and you're having these feelings and you share with your friends, that's actually very healthy for you, and it's healthy for them. So vicarious trauma is kind of like a small ripple in the water when you throw a pebble in it. And the bigger the pebbles are, the smaller the impact. So think of each support system that you tell is a bigger part of that ripple. And essentially, by the time you've told a third person, the vicarious trauma is so small that you're not adding to their bucket of vicarious trauma, you're just addressing yours. So I encourage you to talk with friends, and I think that sharing knowledge is really powerful. Unfortunately for me, because I do identify as a female, females had more vicarious trauma according to this research. And in general, that is across the board for all the research I found on vicarious trauma. Most sexual assault crisis counselors and investigators, detectives, all of those fields have been researched, like I have with the educators model, and females are always a little bit higher. What does that mean? I don't know, but that's something to be aware of. Age was a significant protective factor, and specifically, the younger you are, the more susceptible you are to vicarious trauma. That kind of makes sense, because when I onboard new staff, they're still green, they haven't experienced a lot, and so they don't know how to handle it. We still don't know if it's maturity or experience that correlates with that age. Status. So yeah, if you're married, and you're happily married, I should say, and if you're in a relationship, in a happy relationship, you get less trauma. And the theory there is that you're talking to them about it. You go home, or you go and have lunch or dinner with them, and you talk about your day. And again, it goes back to the support system. So if it's in a mutual happy relationship where you have a voice and can share in a safe space, you have a protective factor. Protective factors are helping you process your vicarious trauma. I wanna, if you have any questions about what is vicarious trauma, what isn't vicarious trauma, please put them in the chat now. I'm going to have, Caroline is gonna tell me what kind of reoccurring question is coming up. She'll unmute herself and let me know. And if there's something that I went over too quickly, we did do a survey, and most of the participants who were saying that they were gonna attend this workshop really wanted the coping strategies, which I will do in the next 30 minutes. But I don't wanna negate that most of us are, academic nerds here and wanna know what the research shows and tells. So were there any questions in the chat?
There haven't been any questions in the chat yet.
Awesome. Very good. Well, I will go on. So, tools and application. Evaluating your response to vicarious trauma is critical. Why? Well, because it will impact your bandwidth moving forward and how you are successful, not only at work, but in your personal life. So these are all tools that I'm going to give you for free because you're my friends. The first one is not something that I designed, but I'm going to tell you all about it. So this is probably when you want to get out your phone and start screenshotting some of my PowerPoint presentations. If you want the PowerPoint presentation, I would say that you can email me afterwards, and we might need to barter, where I send you a survey, or you can give me a testimonial, so that way it's a shared knowledge there. Because I do want to hear how everyone is absorbing this information. So the first one I'm going to go over is professional quality of life. Some of you know about this because I've told you about it, but surprisingly, not many people know about this. So this is a free assessment tool. You go to proquil.org. It's PROQOL. And actually, Dr. Stam is the most well-known assessment tool for vicarious trauma. There is no other tool currently for higher ed or K through 12 that is measuring our vicarious trauma in many of the other sectors. So like doctors, nurses, all of those default to this tool as well. The tool's pretty basic. It's 30 questions. I'll show it to you. But before I show it to you, I wanted to show you that link there. If you go to her website, Dr. Stam is now retired, but she has a robust team that works for her. Since COVID, they have created free uploads of the helper pocket card. Those are super cute. I would print out a bunch. I would share it with your staff, especially like your RAs, your residential life staff, student conduct, anybody doing any of this kind of work right now. A lot of our diversity friends, disability friends, like friends are in those offices doing that, you know, services to students. Those students could really benefit from these kinds of things as well, because you can imagine if you have an accommodation, how difficult it is to online learn or these other helping professions that we do. So let me show you the scale. This is what it kind of looks like, 30 basic questions. The first question I always get, and it says, I am happy. And you have to score yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 if you feel you're happy. And everyone, every time I've ever done these workshops has said, well, am I happy like right now? Or am I happy in life? Or am I happy in my marriage? Am I happy at work? The rubrics is dependent on you. So it's in general, do you feel happy? And what STAM has done is created this tool for you to do it 30 days after the incident. So there's research out there on Hurricane Katrina, for example, and all the social workers and all the first responders that addressed Hurricane Katrina had to do their ProQuil before they got back on the job. Because we don't have any other better assessment tool for this kind of work, I would say the 30 days is flexible. So I typically like to do it with my staff when they first onboard, and then at a midpoint, either that's like Thanksgiving or winter break or like spring break. And it's a good kind of touch point because it gives you 3 different outcomes. It's going to give you your vicarious trauma score, your compassion satisfaction, and your burnout. Your burnout is basically the lowest of the unhappiness level, and the compassion satisfaction is the highest. Some people really like to know where they measure. You know, you might be the person that really likes to be on a scale in order to lose weight, or you're just checks and balances. You like to know how you're leveling out. This scale is for you. Not only is it free, but you can do it numerous points within your career. I've given it to friends. I've given it to people. Like, have I given it to people on a blind date? Maybe. But the point being is that you can really see how you're feeling after an incident. Your compassion satisfaction should always be higher than your burnout. And if it's not, that's when that might be the aha moment for you. And ironically, staff who have transitioned out of their positions, who have done this tool, said, you know, I realized things weren't happy for me because it was a baseline that I was way overboard. The second thing I would say about this tool is when you read the sentence that says, for example, I like my work as a helper, and that's number 12. You, in your job, whether you're doing diversity work, you're doing conduct work, you're doing, you know, maybe you're a faculty member, maybe you're someone that, you know, has a high touch point, maybe you're someone that's not necessarily on the ground with students anymore because you're upper management. You might not identify as a helper. And I get that because in higher ed, we never really are. And, you know, when you got your master's, if you were in a higher program, you're not taught any of this stuff. But I challenge you to replace that helper word with just whatever your title is. So I like my work as an assistant dean, blah, 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 blah. Because that might help you to get away from like my job. You might not feel like a helping all the time because you might be delivering some hard information. But this tool is the best we've got until one of you feel like you're ready to take on a new assessment tool. It's fun to do. All right, the second tool I'm going to give you is called Mapping Your Response to Trauma Exposure. So specifically, I took out the 16 warning signs from Lipsky's book. You may or may not own it. If you don't own it, I recommend it, but I didn't want you to wait for your Amazon delivery to come. So I'm gonna give it to you here. So you can screenshot these 16 questions. So basically, what I did was I added to the sentence that was already there. So number one, a sense that one can never do enough. So if that's you, and you're gonna do an inventory of all 16, and you're gonna star which ones really are you, as in, do you feel you should be doing more to solve a problem? And if that is you, and you're like, wow, Jill, you are talking to me, that's how I felt this morning, circle it. And you're gonna do that for all 16 factors. And the reason why is you're essentially diagnosing your emotional response, and that will help you to move forward with how to address it. So the first one is kind of the most frequently, like currently what's happening with COVID. A lot of people resonate with that. But also number 7 is exhaustion and physical ailments. So examples, do you feel drained? Have you done so many Zoom meetings that you're like, I really can't give anymore? Like, I am averaging 8 students a day with an hour meeting each. It's a lot, but I'm doing that to myself because I know what the research says I should do. I should space them out, maybe pick up a couple Saturdays and Sundays. The problem is COVID isn't allowing me to do that currently. And I see the end of the tunnel because we have like 3 to 4 weeks left of the semester. So if I know that I'm going to give all to my students now because they're experiencing death in their family or displacement and struggles, but I feel drained, am I really serving them? And most experts would say no, because then I'm not giving my full percent to them. And it's best then to cut myself off and feel, okay, my max is 6 a day. And then I don't feel exhausted after 6. So those are the first 7. These are the rest of them. So take a picture of it and use this later down the line. The one that I find, I feel like number 11, the guilt, as an example, do you see pain or suffering at work and yet enjoy life? That's really prevalent right now with the colleagues that I'm talking to. 15 is pretty serious. So I put it, addictions is what she wrote. And I wrote, as an example, do you self-medicate with happy hour? Listen, higher ed, educators, we really know how to party. Happy hours are great for some, but not for all, especially those colleagues that it's not a healthy time for them to be drinking, or they are in recovery themselves, or abstain. So I challenge you to reframe those happy hour Zoom invites and call them social hours. You are being more worldly, you're being more inclusive of those that don't drink or that might trigger them. So after you take your inventory, you're going to try to pick at least 3 and focus on those, okay? And then the next strategies, once you know the problem, you can always work to it, but it is going to be work. Like I said, vicarious trauma isn't something that you can just vent about and be done. It's work. It's constant. All right, so now the third one. CSDT, Constructivist Self-Development Theory, it's pretty amazing. In my research, I found that theory to be the best when talking about vicarious trauma. And most of us in higher ed and in student affairs in particular love student development theory. And this is just another nuance that others have used when looking at vicarious trauma. According to the theory, individuals create their realities through the development of cognitive schema, beliefs, and expectations about themselves. So essentially, you are changing as a person because of what you hear. I buy into that. Like, I know that I think I'm a better professional now than when I was, 17 years ago when I got into the field. But I know that who I am evolves because I have conversations with colleagues about how they're raising their children differently because of stories that they heard, or they have stopped going places and socializing because of stories that they heard. So the way that we live our life has dramatically changed because of COVID, but also because of what you do for a living, it is very possible that the choices that you make in your daily life have changed because of what you hear from your students, your staff, your faculty, your friends. And so this is the breakdown of the theory. There's 5 different parameters: frame of reference, self-capacities, ego resources, memory, psychological, and cognitive. I'm going to break each one down to you because I know that that seems really overwhelming for someone you've maybe never even heard of this theory before. But this is a nice visual. I really liked this one. So lots of words, but I wanted you to have it all in one slide that you can just take a picture of. Frame of reference. So think about when you're working with a student or the last time that you heard something that really upset you. You know that you had to shake it off in some capacity. Did what they say or share with you lead you to change the way that you view yourself or the world or your relationships? So how do you process this activity is what I normally do in the workshops is you take that previous one, that 16 different parameters, and plot it into one of these factors. Or you can just simply say, I feel, so if I asked you, what was the worst thing that you heard this week? You know, what do you think was the most traumatic, vicarious story that you heard from a student? And say, I feel blank, or when my student told me blank, I felt blank. So it's really kind of owning how you're feeling in the moment. And then you're going to plot it into where you are in the theory so that you're more aware. And that'll make you pause and shift your vicarious trauma. So the second one is your self-capacities. They've changed or they've been challenged. So for example, your ability to process emotions, feel worthy of love, and loving others. It makes sense to me that I have colleagues and clients calling, emailing, texting, saying, I can't watch the news anymore. I'm no longer wanting to hug my partner. You know, I'm just not in the mood anymore with my partner. That makes sense to me because what we're hearing right now is a lot of negative, depressing stories, and it's the reality of what we're in. So if I find that my colleagues and friends aren't having, you know, intimate times, it makes sense. And so you have to dig deeper is what is going on with your students or the people that you serve? Is that impacting you? And if so, we've got to work on that because at least we know where it's coming from. And it might not actually have to do with your partner at all, but it has to do with where you are with your emotional response with all the information you heard all day. I had a lawyer that I was working with, a social worker I was working with, and a nurse. And all 3 said the nurse was in the emergency room, that, you know, with the blood and the gore and just having to hear all these traumatic stories of sexual violence, they were no longer interested in that component of their life. And that makes sense. But once we identify it and we acknowledge it, embrace it, we can then come up with ways to address it. So this is another strategy, is to plot yourself into the mapping your response of the theory. The third one is your ego resources, and that's your capacity of empathy or self-awareness, your psychological needs, so that's specifically intimacy, esteem, power, trust, safety, independence. So if you heard a story from a student who said something egregious happened to them, they went to the airport and they were treated unkindly and they believe it had to do with who they were, their identity, that might give you pause when you go to the airport, or other stories that you might hear of violence that happens in bars or restaurants or other situations. Cognitive schema, that's the 4th one, and that's examples of belief, assumptions, expectations of self and others. That's really powerful, and they normally couple with the last one, which is your memory, and that's having specific flashbacks. So think of the way, I talk with a lot of colleagues who say, because I am a Title IX agent, or because I've heard these stories of students, I now teach my children different ways And I remember when I was in college, so on and so forth. So that example, not only are they changing their beliefs and their assumptions, but they're also having flashback. Some people ask me, can you live in like all of these different parts of the theory at once? Yes, you can have an example that touches on like 2 or 3. The most common one for our group was frame of reference. Without a doubt, I had 44.7% of my participants with my research say, with the work that I do in education, frame of reference is the most leading impact to my framework as a person. So that's powerful. So between your ProQuil, which is going to box you into core numbers that for those people that really need numbers, you can baseline yourself. The mapping your trauma will give you more insight into your emotional response and kind of give you a platform to address that specific feeling at that time. And then this activity lets you kind of identify your overall feelings of vicarious trauma and gives you some kind of logic behind it. I don't know that a lot of people give them the space to feel what they feel. Some participants in my research and clients have said, I don't like to admit my vicarious trauma because it makes me feel weak or that I'm not good at my job. We all know that that is kind of a myth. That's not reality. We got to dig deeper into a field of why do we do that to ourselves. But this is all stuff that I want my staff to do. I want them to constantly check in with me on how they're doing because it can lead to burnout. So if we're not talking about it as a profession, I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves. Okay, sensory care. So this is something that I developed with working with specifically social workers, and it's going to tap into the opposite. So one theory is identify your vicarious trauma, how does your body respond to it, and kind of cope with it that way. Another side is more inspirational. Well, if I can increase my compassion satisfaction, does that then get it at the back end? And the answer is yes. So whichever way that you go to handle your vicarious trauma, there's no wrong way of doing it. Anything is better than doing nothing. So sensory care it connects to compassion satisfaction, which STAM identifies is the way that you feel positively about colleagues and your ability to contribute to work settings and a greater good of society. So you just feel better. So yes, I'm taking in all of this like minutia crap for better words, but if I can work and balance it with some happiness, then I can level out. In this activity, it takes a little bit of work, but it's for those that are in the moment, like I just got off of a Zoom and I'm triggered, I'm activated, I'm feeling really sad or angry or upset because of what a student just shared with me. If you feel in a rut and you're like, I just need to do something, a quick fix, this is your quick fix. The first step is to identify which of the 5 sensory components is your leading. So there's touch, there's hearing, there's seeing, there's smelling. Which one is your leading one? And this is probably when you're thinking to yourself, I don't know which is my one. That's okay, I can help you through that. So if you know, great. If you don't know, you've got to start eliminating each one to feel which one feels the most awkward, and that's your most likely your leading one. Individuals who are born hearing impaired, they still hear. It's just they hear differently. They might hear vibrations. It's same with vision impairment. They will see different, heat senses. So you have all 5. One is going to be your leading, and you've got to decide which one it is. I can work individually with you if you're still like struggling, like I really don't know which one is my number one, because there are some questions I can ask you for us to determine and kind of hone in on specifically which is your leading. So once you found your leading, and I will disclose that mine is my sense. I can smell things a mile away. Have I asked students to leave my office from body odor? Yes, I have, because I cannot function. And I have never done it disrespectfully, but it's why I have like lotion near my desk all the time because of the smells. I typically have candles going in my office or my home, and I've been called, like my friends in residence life have called me into their office and said it smells like something died. And I'm like, yeah, it's a rat right there in the wall. Like it's very odd, I know, but everyone has one that is more prominent than the others. You find your one and you nurture it. So a ritual that I have with one client, she's a therapist and she has a pretty significant caseload. Hers is feel. So we identified that that was her number one through all these other questions I had to ask. After each client, regardless if it's a good meeting or not, because counseling sessions are intense, after each client, she literally gets up and goes to a sink and washes her hands. What does that do? Well, water therapy is very powerful, but for her, in working with her, the water is symbiotic of cleansing out the vicarious trauma. And believe it or not, that's a time where she does her deep breathing and she kind of clears out her mind. It's a very holistic concept. But if you can identify what your number one is and nurture that after you get your vicarious trauma components, you do kind of do a reset to the brain. Other strategies, other than if your smell, is really good to have other scents. And I've done that. I have colleagues that are probably nodding their head on this call going, I didn't realize that's why she constantly lotions her hands. She must be stressed a lot. But rituals are important. We're taught in education to try and get children right now a lot of routine, and we thrive in routine. So if you can identify when you get triggered with your vicarious trauma, when you get activated by those stories, where do you land? And then what your leading sense is to be able to nurture it, you can do that after each time that you get activated. If you want more examples on that, we can work about that. So that's sensory care. Books. So my subject matter expert, Jason Newell, wrote a book in 2017 that came out, and that is called Cultivating Professional Resilience in Direct Practice. And so he specifically talked about social workers and therapists and such. There's some activities in that book that are worth it, and there's tons of book on vicarious trauma. I'm just trying to think of, for higher ed, K through 12, educators, that book, even though it doesn't talk about our field, there was a lot of correlations. And then the second one, even though it's a little bit older, it is trauma stewardship. And the reason why I like Lipsky's trauma stewardship is because it's a good read. It's a book that you can really relate to when you're talking about vicarious trauma, but she does storytelling. And the stories echo your response, and you can find yourself shaking your head a lot. And I've given this book to staff members and they're like, that was the best book. So even though these books aren't talking about higher ed or educators in general, these books, they're the best for this kind of work. Now you might find other books that you really like, and I don't think there's a problem with that. These are just my two favorites. Online resources. So Eric Gentry is kind of like the second coming of Dr. Figley that I mentioned, who's the father of vicarious trauma. Eric actually studied under Figley, so there's some amazing stories in everything that he does. And his online media is great and it's free. So check that out. And then I really there's so many online stuff, and you want to definitely look at what is credible sites versus someone who's just talking about this to sell their product. Joyful Heart Foundation has a great image. It's like a tree, and they have resources for vicarious trauma. I really like the component of having visuals in your office. For those that are more, eyes visual was your leading, the Joyful Heart Foundation has a lot of stuff that you can print out and put in your office to remind yourself to center during the time that you get vicarious trauma. So other things from my heart here, because I do want to open up for some questions and such. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure all of us have access to ProQuest through your library, and you can download my dissertation. The only reason why I'm plugging my dissertation is because I have, 100 references and citations, and all of them, if you wanted to learn more about vicarious trauma and the workforce of law enforcement, or vicarious trauma and SANE nurses, or vicarious trauma There's really good studies that I cited in that dissertation. So maybe even just looking at the references, that'll give you guidance on your next research for yourself, learning about others and what else is out there. Most universities have already sent out EAP guidance. If you're not seeing a healthcare professional right now, that's fine. Like I'm not, you can do whatever you want, you know that. But telehealth with a counselor right now is really helpful for a lot of people. So I encourage you to look into that. And some institutions are putting forward free yoga sessions online and other things that are specifically for our group. So that's good. Self-care versus group care. So our field is notorious of like throwing out terms like self-care. I think self-care is important, but it doesn't work for everybody, especially those that live alone or don't have resources or finances. So group care is something that I would prefer. I love the requests for group gatherings online, you know, theme nights, game nights, social hours versus happy hours. Those are all important. Group care is the idea of what we're doing right now. It's literally like me sharing with you a little bit of what I've learned about over the past 5 years with my research. And it's this idea that like, I don't gain anything from you getting this information other than I'm hoping it helps you. You know, group care is just as important as self-care. Mentees and mentors. Yeah, it's proven that having a mentee database, you helping others, that increases your ability, your protective factor for your vicarious trauma, and having mentors as well. So I currently have about, I want to say 10 mentees, but I also don't have children, so I kind of can give that bandwidth. But having one mentee and one mentor to be able to process things with or to inspire can be a protective factor for yourself. Your time off and your advocacy right now is important. You know, I'll be the first to admit I worked on Good Friday. I probably wasn't supposed to, but it was better for me to get a few students in to space it out. Not only did I feel better about myself, but I felt like I was able to then not work on Saturday and really be off of Zoom. So it's all about that. Balancing the news, media, and Zoom right now is essential, and going back to your basics. So everything that we tell our students, are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you going for walks? Did you have sunlight? Can you get off your phone? All those things are ways that you have to address your vicarious trauma, okay? So the last thing I'm going to say, you know, type in your questions right now, please, into the chat. The only people that are impacted by vicarious trauma are people that care. So think about that. When your staff member or someone says, oh, I don't get vicarious trauma, I would pause. I would seriously reconsider them, because does that mean they don't care? Because it's literally the definition of vicarious trauma. The only people that get vicarious trauma are people who care. How can you be a healthcare provider or in law enforcement or the military and an educator and not care? You would have to be a sociopath. And I don't want sociopaths on my staff. I don't. So we need to embrace vicarious trauma as a strength. It's even better if you are someone that can hone into where are the components of vicarious trauma that resonate with you. Are you in a bad mood because of your vicarious trauma? That's okay. I can deal with that, because now we know that you care, that you're taking that from other students, and now we just need to do one of these strategies on how to address it. I hope that makes sense. Caroline, are there any questions for me?
Yes.
Yeah?
Does it count as vicarious trauma when you learn of stressful stories indirectly? So through the news, through social media?
Yeah. Did I fail at that point? I'm sorry. Yes. Yes, 100%. Yes, yes, yes.
And how do you deal with / approach coworkers who are affecting your professional quality of life? And the example was for coworkers who are negative.
So the coworker is negative and bringing you down?
Yes.
Yeah, it's hard. If you are a colleague you might want to share with them some of the strategies that you learned today and do it as like a professional development within the office. That way you're not outing them. Space from those individuals, I think, is important. And if you supervise them, then you can mandate a lot more of these practices. The thing is that negative people like negative people, right? So to the best of your ability, you've got to create space to get away from them. So if you're a social worker, for example, and everyone that you work with is all negative, like you don't have to interact with them that much because you can just go into private practice, go into your office with your student alone, with your client. But if you're on a staff team and there's somebody negative and it's bringing you down, the best thing to do is disattach yourself from them, because spending too much energy into them not being negative is not the best thing. That's essentially what I've learned with being in higher ed. Like, I try to inspire and motivate others, but sometimes the best thing to do is to put yourself first, give them the support and love, but walk away a little bit is probably the best. Any other questions?
Are there
I
any
talk
patterns
fast.
to which coping strategies work for people based on their identities? For example, are there certain coping strategies that tend to work better for men?
Yeah, admitting that you have vicarious trauma would always be helpful. Most of the clients that I see and talk to are, there is this, I am a police officer. My job is to be in charge of everything and not let things get to me. And a lot of them, I'm trying to get them to understand is that the best police officers are the ones that also care. That yes, you're good at your job of keeping us safe, but if there's a police officer on the street that's a jerk and one that's nice, and they're both doing the job well and they both can take care of me well, I'm going to the nice one. And reframing that you can do both successfully. You can be caring and take care of yourself and do the job well, is the first thing. And then the second thing for men, I think that most of the guys that I talk to really like the second activity that I showed, which were the 16 measures, because that seems less aggressive and like low cost, low risk to be able to say, yeah, that's totally me. Like, and being honest with yourself, I think, is important too.
Can you speak more about group care and perhaps suggestions for supervisors/organizations for how they can encourage/foster group care?
Yes. So right now, our division is hosting professional development activities on the first Friday of every month, and it's from 12 to 1. And I think that a good supervisor does what I see, which is bring your lunch, sit down, watch it if you want to, and if not, that's okay. So it's giving new content in a group atmosphere. It's highlighting the skills and the talents within the division. It's doing it on our lunch break, so if we can't attend, we don't have to. And it's giving us the permission to still take care of ourselves while absorbing this new information. So if you're creating a model where you're highlighting other people's talents and it's not always the leadership, that would be an example of group care. Like, who below the levels of higher can be shown to highlight their skills? That is group care, because you're showing within the division the talents doesn't always have to be from the VP or higher levels. Other holistic group care techniques, other than like the obvious, like, I just got roped into this yesterday, so that's why I'm thinking about it. And I saw a solicitation from my alumna institution too, is the STEP challenge. The STEP challenge in teams is literally an example of group care. So are you fostering ways to take care of yourself in the group setting and correlating that to the workplace, instead of assuming that, like, oh, you have a problem with vicarious trauma, okay, go to therapy. That insinuates that it's on my own time, that it's my own problem, and there's no platform for me to take care of that in the workplace. But if the workplace became more aware that we need to balance the day-to-day hours, that is a group care initiative.
And then how can we help our students when they have lost all of the things they would usually do to cope with stress?
Well, this is like putting me on the spot, but sometimes I find that with my students, because I care our Students of Concerns team, one of the challenges that I'm seeing with my students is that they physically don't want to be home. Like they don't like their room, they don't like their parents, they don't feel safe there. Not physically safe, but just like safe, like academically to do what they want to do without someone over them, hovering them. And I encourage them to go to their sensory care activities that I do with them. So what makes them happy? And they're always like, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, well, like physically show me your room right now. And they'll take their computer and they show me around. And I'm like, there's no reminders in your room whatsoever that you're in college. And they're like, yeah, I know. I'm like, okay, but are you in college or are you in high school? And a lot of them, the bell starts going off. And I'm like, I would love for you to kind of like, can we redecorate? Could we paint? Could we move the room around? Could we, like, you don't even have like a placard that says that you go to Quinnipiac University. Like, but when you go to the university residence room, it's everywhere. It's like very college-esque. There's like a presence that they're in college. And I'm like, I get that we're in COVID and we didn't have a lot of time to do this, but we need to shift that this room that you're in that has all these high school memories, we've got to make them college memories because you're in college, just happen to be physically home while you're in college. So let's revamp. That has been helpful. I'm not saying it solves, food insecurity by any means and these bigger things, but that's just really quick because I know our time is almost up. I encourage my students to really think about, like, from mind to body, looking at all their sensories, what can we do to gain control over a situation that we don't have control over?
Mm-hmm.
So this is my contact information. This is my personal email, my website. I want you to stay safe, take care of yourself. I want you to follow NASPA Region 1's Facebook because they're going to be doing series like this more often. I want to thank you for your time. I want to tell you that if you're not a NASPA member and you want to learn out more, here is 2 great informational spots for you. I hope that you'll stay connected with us and that you'll let NASPA know, was a session worth your hour time? What other sessions would you like to hear? How can we support you? I know that this is not solving all of your stress. I know that, but I'm hoping that something will resonate with you and help you in a different way than you had before the session.
Jill, thank you so much for presenting to us today. I think this is such a timely topic. I saw you present a year or 2 ago and by the importance of it then, but I feel like right now it becomes even more important. And my takeaway is one, the normalizing of vicarious trauma that, I assume we're all people who care and that we're all going to be experiencing some degree of trauma as we deal with this current situation. And your sharing of all these great self-assessments. Take it from here in terms of exploring things and knowing that you remain a resource. So thank you very much. And thank you all for attending. I saw we had like 7 people from out of Region 1, which I think is fabulous. So welcome people from other regions. You're welcome anytime. And next week at this time slot, we are having a panel discussion called Layoffs, Furloughs, and Closings. What if it happens to me? Another stressful topic for many people. And so please join us next week. I will be recording this, or I have recorded it. I see the recording will be available, and I will be sending it to our Region 1 so we can look at a way to make it available if people miss it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.